Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Introduction to Python for Data Science workshop. This is a continuation of the Introduction to Data Science workshop series that is being put on by the KAUST Visualization Core Laboratory. Our goal with this Introduction to Data Science workshop series is to try to build capacity and the foundational tools for doing data science and machine learning here in KAUST and more generally here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so very happy to have a large group today of over 40 participants. I think we have participants not just here from within KAUST, but we also have some participants from KFUPM and possibly a few participants from Aramco as well. So welcome, very happy to have everybody. My name is Dr. David Pugh. I am a staff scientist at the KAUST Visualization Core Laboratory, where my focus is on data science, machine learning training, and provision of data science and machine learning consulting services to staff, faculty, students here at KAUST, as well as our research park tenants here at KAUST. And I also work on projects with entities outside KAUST here in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Electric Company was a recent client that I worked with. As well as others. So if you are interested in collaborating with us, please reach out, contact myself or Glendon or anyone at the Viz Lab, and we'd be happy to talk to you about your machine learning or data science problems. Okay, so if you've just joined us, I have put in the top of the chat menu about 4 or 5 links that are important for today. So the first link that I put is a link to the course GitHub repository. So I'll start sharing my screen now. So the first link I pasted in the chat was to the course GitHub repository. Let's just move this over here a little bit. Okay. So this is the Introduction to Data Science Workshop GitHub repository. So this has the teaching materials for not just today's workshop, but all the workshops that I teach over the course of, or I have taught over the course of this fall 2020 semester. So there are materials for Introduction to Conda, Introduction to Shell, Introduction to Git, Introduction to SQL, which is what I taught last week, and then Introduction to Python, which is what we're teaching today. A couple weeks from now, I'll be teaching the Introduction to Conda course again, not next Tuesday, but I think maybe the Tuesday after that. So maybe in 2 weeks' time, I'll be teaching Introduction to Conda again. So feel free to register and tune in when that for that workshop. All the workshops in this Introduction to Data Science workshop series have been recorded and are available on the KAUST Viz Lab YouTube channel. So you can go back and watch. If you missed any of these previous trainings, you can go back and watch them. And the hands-on materials and the computing infrastructure that we used in those workshops is available 24/7. So if you want to go back and go through and actually work through the hands-on portions of those labs, or those workshops, you can do that as well. And after today, you will understand how to access the computing infrastructure to do that if you wish to do that. So please look through the chat, make sure that you can have this link. I guess I'll put it in the chat again just to be safe. So I'm pasting again for reference. Here's the link to the GitHub repository. Okay. Now, I mentioned hands-on portion of today's workshop and computing infrastructure. So let's talk about that next. So the way these workshops go is that it's a mix of lectures and hand-on live coding demonstrations by myself, and then opportunities for you to both, of course, follow along with those live coding demonstrations, but then also to practice on some hands-on exercises. So normally, when I teach this workshop in person, I have everybody bring their laptops, and we spend about the first 30 minutes to an hour, depending, getting everybody installed with a local computing environment with Python and Jupyter Lab and everything that you need to run the hands-on portion of the course material on your own laptop. Obviously, in this new virtual training environment, that's not going to be possible. So instead, I have taken advantage of a great resource called mybinder.org. The Binder project is a major project from the Jupyter community, which is responsible for Jupyter Lab and BinderHub and Ipython and many of the kind of core infrastructure projects in the scientific computing and data science, machine learning parts of the Python ecosystem. And it's just a nice little tool that will turn a GitHub repository into an interactive collection of notebooks running on top of cloud infrastructure or infrastructure that's been contributed by research organizations around the world. So that's my plug for Binder. I've used it heavily for over 5 years now, and it's just a fantastic resource for both for teaching, like in this kind of a setup, or for taking research that you are working on and sharing it with your peers and research colleagues or your projects in a way that people can actually run the code that that you've written. So that's what we're going to use today. So in the README file of the GitHub repository, there are several buttons right across the top of the README. So the one on the left, it says Launch KAUST BinderHub. So if you are inside of KAUST, so if basically you are either on the KAUST campus and connected to the KAUST intranet, or you are outside of KAUST, but you are connected into the KAUST intranet via our VPN, then you can launch the KAUST BinderHub by clicking this button, maybe opening it in a new tab. What this does is it launches the course materials for today on top of computing infrastructure that's running here inside of KAUST on KAUST servers. And it should take about maybe 30 seconds to a minute to launch. Yep. So if you are, again, if you're here on the KAUST campus, or you are connected to the KAUST intranet via VPN from off campus, then you should be able to click that button and you will see Jupyter Lab running in a browser. And if you look at the link up here, you will see jbinder.kaust.edu.sa. So that's running on KAUST infrastructure. If you are joining us from KFUPN or Aramco, or you're off campus at KAUST and you just don't have VPN access, then you can use the second button, where it says Launch Public Jupyter Lab. So if you were to right click on that and open that link in a new tab, then again, after maybe 30 seconds or a minute, hopefully not too much longer than that, the Jupyter Lab instance will open, and you will get the exact same computing environment, just running on different remote servers. So because the public BinderHub, the servers are spread all over the world and contributed by different organizations, your link up here might look a little bit different. So mine says hub.gke2. So that just means that actually this is running on Google's Kubernetes engine. So this is running on infrastructure that's been donated by Google to the BinderHub and Binder project. There are other organizations, the Turing Institute in the UK. You might land on their resources. They have resources running in Azure's, Microsoft's cloud that they've donated. You might land on OVH, which is another cloud provider that has donated resources. And in the near future, we're working with our colleagues at the IT Research Computing, who is responsible for delivering the internal to KAUST BinderHub. trying to collaborate with them to see if we can also here at KAUST contribute some resources to the public BinderHub Federation, so that maybe in the future, anybody who's joining outside of KAUST, particularly from here inside Saudi Arabia, will land on some KAUST infrastructure that is actually public and available to anybody in the world. Okay, so before I move on, I just want to make sure that that this is working for everyone. So I'm going to actually close out the public BinderHub tab because I only need one, and I'll keep the KAUST BinderHub open. So if you could just go to participants and then just check yes if you have been able to get one of these BinderHubs up and running. And if you've not, then please check no, and then Glendon should be lurking about in the chat or in the background, and he will he can help you if there are any issues. And again, you know, it might take a little bit longer. Okay, so we have one person, two people. Okay. Oh, no, we only have one. So I'm just going to wait and see if wait for a minute just to see if those a couple of no's that we had go away. It could just be that it's taking a little bit longer to load for you. That is certainly a possibility. Okay, Glendon, are you there?
I'm here. So just a few things. So someone asked for the link for Binder, but it's actually, so the link is a little button on the top of the GitLab, the GitHub page.
I'll paste it into the chat too. So I'll just do a copy. And the first one I'll put is the, okay, so I'm sending to everyone. Okay, so here is the link to the KAUST BinderHub. And then right-click, copy. And remember, you will only be able to access the KAUST BinderHub if you are either on KAUST campus or you are connected to the KAUST intranet via VPN. So the next link to the public BinderHub. The next link is the one that you should use if you are from KFUPM or Aramco, or you're joining from off campus and are not connected via VPN. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I still got a couple of no's. So Glendon, I'm going to create a breakout room.
Well, thank you.
Let me just stop sharing my screen for a moment. So try to create one breakout room. And then I will assign Glendon. And then I will put the participants who are still having trouble. Okay, so for a couple of you who have checked no that you're still having trouble connecting to a BinderHub, so I'm going to add you to a breakout room with Glendon. So you'll receive a little pop-up note that will basically ask you to join a breakout room. And then Glendon can help you basically get unstuck. All right, so let's see. I'll rename this as General Assistance breakout room. Yes. Okay. Okay. Okay, so Glendon will now help out those individuals who are still stuck. And I'm going to go back and share my screen. I'm just going to talk through a little bit more about the computing environment, and then wait until Glendon joins us back again. Okay, so sharing my screen. Okay, so just another note about the Binder hubs where Jupyter Lab is running. So again, these are computing resources that they're not running locally on your computer. You're accessing them via the web browser on your computer, but the computing is actually being done on a remote server somewhere in either here in KAUST or somewhere in the cloud, somewhere around the world, Europe, North America, probably Europe or North America if you're running on the public BinderHub. Okay. Now, because these are kind of shared resources, if you they will time out, and kind of behind the scenes on those remote servers, idle resources will be reclaimed after about 30 minutes. So just be mindful to try to keep your BinderHub active. So once we get into the hands-on portions, it won't be that big of a deal because every 5 to 10 minutes you're going to be typing stuff anyway. But just keep an eye on your resources as we're getting started today, where I have to talk a little bit more just to get us going, that you don't allow your notebook to go idle. So as long as you're like doing anything, so clicking on a folder or anything like this, or opening a file, basically any interaction with Jupyter Lab will keep those resources from being marked as idle and being reclaimed. Okay. There is some global timeout, which is like 12 hours, but we're not going to go anywhere near that. So it's more just a 30-minute idle time. Now, later, once we finish the morning session, of course, we'll close everything down. And we will start again in the afternoon. So there is a way, if you want to download your notebook from the cloud down to your local machine to save it for later, there's a way to do that. I'll talk about that. If I somehow forget, and that's of interest, someone remind me at the end of the morning session. I'll walk you through the process of saving the notebook down to your local machine. And then you can also upload the same notebook into the cloud if you want to use the same notebook from this morning for this afternoon session. And we'll walk through that later. Everything that I type today, I will save and then upload to the GitHub repo later for reference. In fact, this notebook is from the version of this course that I taught earlier this semester. So we'll have a sandbox 2 or something like that for today's teaching materials, and I'll put that up for reference. Okay, cool. So Glendon, you're back now. So I assume that everything has been sorted.
Yes, everyone's good.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so let's just kind of switch over to the workshop webpage for today, and I'm just going to walk you through what we're going to cover, and then we're going to get started on teaching. So the link to this page was at the very top of the chat. It's there for reference, so you can go and find it. It was also sent around in the email yesterday and in the registration form. So basically what we're going to cover today is the basics of Python programming. So I assume that you know nothing about Python programming. And so we're going to talk about the basics of Python. We're going to talk about some of the key data science libraries, machine learning libraries that you kind of need to know before you can go and look at more advanced libraries that actually perform machine learning or deep learning. So these are the libraries that kind of underpin all of that. The more advanced topics and are kind of prerequisites in order to tackle some of those advanced topics. So we're going to talk about Jupyter, in particular Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebooks. We're going to talk about NumPy, which is a library for doing scientific computing and dimensional arrays in Python. It's used by many, if not all, of the more advanced libraries for doing machine learning and data science at some level. Pandas, which is a library for doing data analysis. So we're going to use that quite a bit today. And Matplotlib, which is just a simple plotting library to help. It's simple in that it's one of the kind of the libraries for plotting that you use to get started, but it's also quite powerful in that you can customize plots for papers and things like that quite easily. And we'll talk about the larger visualization ecosystem a little bit. So in particular, here's like a rough sketch of how the day is going to go. So this morning, we're going to be on kind of introduction to Python for about an hour and a half. So just the very basics. Hopefully by mid-morning, we'll start talking a little bit about pandas, and then we'll break for lunch. Then after lunch, we're going to be doing building programs in Python. So this is going to be kind of putting together the individual pieces that we learned in the morning. And then we'll end up maybe in the afternoon with some kind of best practices and some more advanced examples and use cases. And I will try to leave about 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions. Okay. So any questions from the audience about today, about how things are going to go? You can put them in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask questions. Anything.
So David, there's one user who is currently waiting that says your session is taking longer than usual to start.
Okay, so if that happens, you can always go back and click the button again. Sometimes when lots of people start launching these instances together, it can you can get caught in a very slow very slow launch time. So you can always just close the tab and go back and click the button again. But eventually it should load. Okay, so then let's move on towards the teaching since it's about 9 o'clock. So I will put a link. Again, this link is already included in the top of the chat, but I'll add it again here since the chat is starting to get a little bit longer. So link to the teaching materials. Okay, so I put the link to the teaching materials in the chat. Again, as I mentioned earlier, these teaching materials are on the public internet, so they're available anywhere in the world, and they're always online. So if you want to come back and go through these materials again, or reference them for something, they're always here. You can come and check them out. The materials themselves have been contributed by the software and data carpentry communities. I did forget to mention that I'm a certified software and data carpentry instructor. Software carpentry and data carpentry are nonprofit organizations whose goals are to teach foundational scientific computing, data science, machine learning skills to researchers around the world. So there are well over 1,000 certified instructors spread across the globe, and we've taught workshops on every continent, including Antarctica. And the materials that we use to teach are developed and contributed by the community of instructors and participants over many, many years at this point. So thank you to the entire software carpentry and data carpentry community that have contributed to these teaching materials. The versions we're using today are a slightly modified version that I have made that is more tuned to the needs here at KAUST. But the majority of the materials have been developed and contributed by the community. So a more detailed outline of the day. I'm not going to go through this in detail because I kind of want to dive into the teaching a little bit. I just want to note that this first lesson here, getting started with Conda, is a lesson that I developed specifically for the in-person versions of the training that we teach, or that we used to teach. And in this lesson, I walk you through how to install and set up your software environment locally on your laptop or your workstation. So I'm just going to go very quickly through that lesson. And then we're going to move on, because the compute environment is already set up for us in Jupyter Lab. We don't need to do any of that. But I will kind of touch on some points, but we're going to dive pretty quickly into running and quitting, so we can actually just get started working with Python programs. Okay. And then we will have a break for lunch and another afternoon coffee break or tea break, and then we'll finish. Okay. Any questions before we start actually diving into the content for today? Nope. Last chance. Going once, going twice. Okay. So let's get started with Conda. Okay. So in this first episode, I'm going to very quickly walk you through the big steps of kind of a local install, so that maybe if you want to run this, if you want to get set up and running everything locally on your laptop or workstation, maybe after this is done, then you will know kind of where to come back and which part of this to reference in order to make that happen. So at the very top of this episode is kind of my kind of too long didn't read version of this episode, which walks you through the sequence of commands that I would use to create the computing environment that would be used for any project generally, but that you could use to create this software environment locally. So I like to encourage all of my users to adopt a workflow where you have a separate software stack for each of your projects. This might sound like, quite a lot of work, but tools like Conda, which is a package and environment management system, manage a lot of the complexity and complicated aspects of managing your software environment for you once you learn how to use them. And then once you learn how to use them, you'll find that actually it's quite straightforward to have these project-specific environments. So I always create, a new directory for my project, and then we're going to see how to create a something called an environment file, which is a structured text file that basically lists all the things that we want to install into the environment. And then there is a single command here that you can use to use Conda to create a software environment in a particular subdirectory of your project using this environment file. And then once you've created an environment from this environment file, you can activate the environment. And then once that environment is active, you have your kind of project-specific software stack for that project, and you can work and use all the software libraries for that project and do all the work that you want. If you've forgotten, you need some more libraries, you can go back and edit the environment.yaml file, and then run this command to update the environment or just reinstall everything. And then when you're done working, you just deactivate it. Maybe you go off and you activate another environment for another project, and then you do that. So that's the too long didn't read version. And then the rest of this episode basically explains what all of these commands are and what they do and how they work. But that's kind of the recipe that I use, broadly speaking, for managing software environments for all my projects. So this first section kind of provides motivation and background for why you should use a package environment management system. And it basically comes down to software installation is a challenge, is difficult. Managing all the different versions for all the software that you need is difficult. So you need a good tool that will manage the packages for the packages and software that you need for you, so you don't have to keep track of all this yourself. And you need to have a tool that will isolate the software for your project from other software for another project, because you might need different software or different versions of the same software for different projects. And so you need this kind of isolation between your project software stacks. And Conda solves both of those problems. You can read through all of the details here if you want. So I've mentioned Conda a lot. So Conda, is a package and environment management tool. It's free and open source. It runs across platforms. So if you're running Linux, Mac, or Windows, it works on all three of those platforms. Conda itself is just a tool, a package and environment management tool. But when you go to install Conda on your local system, you'll be installing a distribution called either Mini Conda or Anaconda. And I encourage all of my users to install Mini Conda. Mini Conda contains the Conda tool plus its own version of Python, so that it never has to actually use the version of Python that's installed on your operating system, which is always a best practice to avoid using the Python that's installed on your operating system. That was put there by the developers of your operating system specifically for use by their operating system, not for use by you as the user. But if you want, you can install Anaconda, which includes the Mini Conda distribution plus several hundred additional packages that you might find interesting or useful. So the rest of this episode walks you through, whether you're on Mac or Linux or Windows, kind of instructions for how to install Mini Conda. So there's a link here, which will take you to the detailed installation instructions that I have created, with links to video tutorials for Windows, Mac. Linux has an installer script, things like that. And then walks you through, once you have done the installation, kind of walks you through how you can check that the installation is working properly. And on our, on Jupyter Lab, you could run through the same sequence of commands. You could open a terminal in Jupyter Lab, and then you could type conda info, and you could see the information about Conda that's installed here inside the Jupyter Lab instance, the particular version that it's running, and things like that. And then after you've checked that you've got the Conda installation set up properly, then the rest of the episode walks you through creating this environment.yaml file and adding the software that we would use for today. So we would add Python, Matplotlib, and pandas at a minimum, and then explains kind of the details of the environment.yaml file and how to activate the environment once you've created it, and all this kind of other stuff. So these are all of the details of using Conda, following the recipe at the top of this episode, basically. But fortunately for us today, we don't actually need to go into the nitty-gritty details of that, because I used Binder to create our software installation for us running in the cloud. And so here is the environment.yaml file for the repository. And you'll notice that it has quite a lot more stuff than just Python. So here's Python and Matplotlib, and there's pandas, and then Jupyter Lab. So it has quite a bit more stuff, but because this is an environment that has to work for not just Python workshop today, but also there's some stuff for Bash and SQL and things like that, I needed to add quite a few extra things to make that work, or to get it kind of ready to go for that. Okay. So any quick questions? I know I went through that very quickly. It wasn't my intention that you would understand kind of everything about how to do that, but just that you would know to go to this lesson for reference if you want to recreate what we have today locally on your laptop or workstation later. So does anyone have any questions about that they want to ask about that before we move on to Python? I guess not. So I would point out, so the last thing I'll say about Conda is that if you want to learn more, then on our YouTube channel, there is the recording from the introduction to Conda from or from earlier this semester. So you can watch that training. It's about 3.5-hour training. If you want to go through and learn Conda from scratch and a lot of the details about how it works. If you don't want to launch the training, then there is the training materials for that workshop, which I am currently developing, are available online. I'll put this link in the chat. This is So these are some lecture materials that I developed from scratch, and I've used them to teach Conda workshops at many major conferences, and as well as here at CALST. And so you can go through quite a lot of material on how to use Conda to do, create simple software stacks up to quite advanced applications requiring compiling custom CUDA extensions for your GPU accelerated data science, things like that. So that's a good reference for all things Conda. Okay. Enlarge the window size. So you mean like make the text bigger? So there's a question in the chat about enlarging the window size. Okay, cool. So I will do maybe that. Let's try that. Okay. Now so we've finished this. So let's move on to so running and quitting. Okay. So this is the first episode where we're going to get into Python and Jupyter Lab. So the basic question that I want to answer in this section is how to run Python programs. So we're going to learn how to. We don't need to launch the Jupyter Lab server because that has already been launched for us here in the cloud. So we don't need to do that. But we're going to look at how to create Python scripts, how to create Jupyter notebooks, talk about the difference between Python scripts and Jupyter notebooks, see how to create markdown cells, how to create and run Python cells in notebooks, just the kind of the basics, the basic user interface and user experience for working with Python within Jupyter Lab, Python scripts, Jupyter notebooks, this kind of thing. Okay. So at this point, I am going to pull up my teaching materials on a separate screen and switch almost entirely to Jupyter Lab. So I'll move back and forth a little bit, but primarily I'm going to be doing kind of live coding demos and things like that in Jupyter Lab. Okay. So in the lecture notes, the first thing we would normally do is activate the environment, but we don't actually have to do that now because we're doing everything within this cloud instance where everything is already set up and ready to go. So I'll just move past that section. So we're going to start with kind of getting started with Jupyter Lab. Okay. So if you have done any coding in any other language, you might have used something called an integrated development environment, or IDE, or a text editor to create and edit your programs. Maybe you've written a little bit of Python in the past, and you might have used text editors or IDEs to write your Python code. A very popular text editor is Microsoft Visual Studio Code. It's by far the most popular modern text editor, and one that I would recommend. If you don't have a good text editor, you might have used, I don't know, PyCharm. Other text editors might be Sublime. Spider is another IDE that is popular within the Python community. The one we're going to use today is JupyterLab. So JupyterLab is kind of the project that evolved out of Ipython, which was started over 15 years ago, I think at this point, maybe closer to 20 years, for doing interactive Python within a terminal window. And just that interactive Python within a terminal window has evolved to what we see in front of us, which is a browser-based application that allows you to not only run things from a terminal, but have access to interactive Python consoles and notebooks, as well as creating text files and writing Python scripts and creating, writing papers, even writing books. It's very extensible. So JupyterLab is itself, it's the front end that what we're using in the browser is written in JavaScript and has an extensive ecosystem of developers who build extensions to extend the core functionality of JupyterLab to do all sorts of new and interesting things. There's a major conference all about the Jupyter project recently. It's called JupyterCon. I was lucky enough to give a talk this year on using Conda to build environments for JupyterLab. Those talks are all coming out on YouTube. So you can search for JupyterCon on YouTube and you'll find their channel with all the talks and everything like that. Very interesting if you want to learn more. So the way that JupyterLab works when we're running Python code is it's going to take our input as users, and it's going to kind of put that input in an envelope, figuratively speaking, and it's going to send it off to the server on which the computing is actually done, and then it's going to run that calculation. It's going to get the results. It's going to send it back to the browser. And so that's kind of how it works. And that's why the front end, this kind of separation of concerns between the front end that the user accesses in the browser and the back end where all the work is actually being done can be done on your laptop or your workstation or some remote server halfway around the world, or servers if you have access to larger scale computing infrastructure, makes it very very powerful, not just for small projects that might work on your laptop, but also for big projects that might require significant computing resources. Okay, so when we start JupyterLab, we have several parts to the UI. So the first is the menu bar. So the menu bar is this part here across the top where you have file, edit, view, run, kernel, git, tab, settings, help, the menu bar. So in the menu bar, you have many kind of options. So you can, from the menu bar, you can create new consoles, notebooks, terminal sessions, text files, things like this. And you can export notebooks. You can log out, shut down. This is where you would like log out or shut down your JupyterLab server if you wanted to do that. Then in edit, you'll see most of the edit functionality is grayed out. That's because we haven't opened a notebook or anything yet. But when we open a notebook, then a lot of these edit options for undoing and redoing, like a Control-Z type operation, are there. Cutting, copying and pasting cells, deleting cells, moving stuff around. So anything like editing a notebook primarily would be in the edit menu. You can, in the view menu, this is where you would find options to kind of change the appearance of JupyterLab a little bit. So, if you wanted to toggle off the left sidebar, you could find that here. There's also a right sidebar. You can toggle that off, this kind of stuff. there is sort of text editor syntax highlighting. So if you wanted to, if you open up a new text file, you could do syntax highlighting for a particular language if you were going to do a script or write a script for a particular programming language, things like this. So run, so you can use the run menu to kind of run different cells in a notebook, but we'll mostly be doing that with keyboards, so I'm not going to bother with that. And then there are some other things here, and I'll mention any of these other settings up here that are important kind of as we go through the day and actually start using things. So I mentioned the left sidebar. That's this part of the UI over here. By default, it's set up on like a file browser, and you can click on the file browser to kind of toggle it if you want to create more space. The file browser allows you to navigate around within the working directory from which the Jupyter Lab server itself was launched. In this case, it was launched kind of from within the directory that was created when this GitHub repo was cloned. So if you notice, if you were to compare the files and directories here in the GitHub repository with what you see in the file browser here, you'll see that it's the same, basically. And then this part here is the main work area, and that's primarily what we're going to be using today. So I'll just toggle the left sidebar out of the way to make our main work area even larger. And from the main work area, from our launcher, we can launch Python notebooks, Python consoles, terminals, text files, things like this. Okay, so if we wanted to create a Python script, so the way we create a Python script would be we click on the text file. So clicking on the text file just opens a new text file. And if we toggle our file browser, we'll see that actually this new text file was created here in the root of our working directory. That's actually not where a good spot to just create a random text file. So I'm actually just going to close this. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on this text file. And if you right click on it, you'll get a menu that will come up that will all kinds of stuff that you can do with that text file, including deletion. So I'm just going to delete it. I'll be prompted, do you want to permanently delete this? Delete. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate into the Introduction to Python directory. And then within the Introduction to Python directory, I have kind of sketched out a rough layout for a good project directory that I use on most of my projects. So I have a source directory where I would put source code for my project, Python scripts, things like this. A results directory where I would save results. A notebooks directory where I keep all my notebooks. Typically, my notebooks are used for kind of prototyping, kind of getting stuff up and running, working quickly. But then anything that I want to use for research will be converted into a Python script and stored in the source directory. There's a data directory for data, a doc directory where I might put copies of my paper that I'm working on, things like that. And then a bin directory where I might put bash scripts where, if I'm working here on Calus and I have access to our computing clusters, then I would put scripts to launch jobs on computing clusters in this bin directory. So just kind of a lot to give you an idea of what a good project directory layout might look like. So if we go into the source directory, now I'll click on the text file. Notice up here at the top of the launcher window, the launcher window has followed us through into the Introduction to Python, into the source directory. And so now when I create this text file, it gets created inside that directory. And now if I go over here to view, I can do text editor syntax highlighting, and I can change this to Python if I want. So I got to go down here through all of the programming languages that are supported in Jupyter Lab and find Python. And now I can type some Python commands. So we're here to learn Python, so we don't really know any Python commands yet. So I will just put print using the print function, and then a print function prints the contents to the standard out. So your standard first program, and now you can hit save. Now we have a Python script that's called untitled.txt. That's not a very good name for Python script. Now, Python wouldn't have any problem executing this script because it would open the script and try to interpret the contents as a valid Python program, which it is, and so it would be fine. But for us humans, it's much better to have a more sensible name. So if you right-click on in the file browser, if you right-click on the name of the file, you can come down here and find rename. And we'll just call this first, I'll call it my first script dot py. Okay, so now we have our my first script dot py, and the .py is the extension for Python scripts. Now it's an extension mostly to indicate to us as humans that the contents of this file is a Python script. But from the Python interpreter's perspective, it doesn't care what the extension is. You give it a file and it will try to interpret that file as a valid Python program. So basically, it's a convention that you should follow, but it's not some requirement that your Python scripts end in .py. Okay, so let's just close my first script. Okay, so we've created a script. And now how about creating a Jupyter notebook? So I have a separate directory for notebooks. So let's go to Introduction to Python, and then let's go into Notebooks. And now we're going to create a notebook. So to create a notebook, we can just go ahead and click on Notebook. And so notice how this has created a notebook called untitled.ipynb, which is the conventional extension used for Jupyter notebooks. And so that's how we open a Jupyter notebook. We can rename this. So instead of untitled, I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call this Sandbox Redo. So this is, whoop. Oh, there we go. Okay. Just you can call it something else. I'm calling it this just to differentiate it from the previous sandbox that I did earlier this semester, so that when I upload our work or my work for this workshop today, it won't overwrite the work that I did earlier this semester. So if we come over here to the lecture notes, so Jupyter notebooks are amazingly flexible. So they allow you to intersperse not just running numerical code, but also interactive data visualizations and things like this. It's stored in a format called JSON. So this is short for JavaScript Object Notation. And that's a particular kind of structured text formatting that browsers understand, and is what allows a browser to render the notebook in the manner in which you actually see in your browser. And it's what allows Jupyter to mix source code, text, images, and things like that all into a single file. Okay. Now, we can actually create and arrange our main workspace in many different ways. So for example, I'm just going to toggle this to give us some more room. So if you go up to File and click on New Launcher, so let's create well, actually, let's go and we'll come back to that. So let's go and open our Python script again. Okay, and now we can do a new launcher, and then we'll open a terminal. Okay. So as you open these, you notice that just like in a browser with tabs, in the main, the launcher basically creates these different tabs. Now, what's really cool about this is that you can drag and drop these tabs to divide up your workspace however you see fit. And then you can actually resize. So if you kind of toggle your mouse in here somewhere, where is it? Then, here. So you can actually resize these windows. So if you wanted to have like a small terminal down here, so if you needed to run terminal commands, you can have a terminal down here. You could also, and then you have your Python script on the top right, your Jupyter Notebook on the top left. If you didn't want a terminal and you wanted actually an Ipython console, then you could open an Ipython console. So by a new launcher, and then we could click on an Ipython console. And now we want to make this a little bit bigger. So now we have an Ipython console where we can type Python commands instead of bash commands. And then because you can do you can type multiple lines of Python code into a Ipython cell. Then if you hit Shift and Enter, that code will be executed inside the console. So these are kind of 3 different ways to use Python. So one is you write a script, and then you can run that script from within the Python, within an Ipython console by typing run and then the path to your script. Sorry, there we go. And then if you hit Shift and Enter, so you can run a script from within an Ipython console, which basically just goes through and executes the commands in the script from top to bottom. Then also from a terminal window, so I can just drag this over here if I wanted. So from within a terminal window, you could write some bash commands to run the same script. So first you would have to navigate into the directory where your Python script lives, which is Introduction to Python source. And then from here, you could run your Python script if you wanted to as well. But that's getting a bit busy, so I'm just going to close that and stick with something like this maybe. So the first exercise that I want you to play around with and just take a few minutes is practice creating different kinds of documents. Just experiment a little bit with JupyterLab and try to drag and drop, move things around so you just get a feel for how it works. Set something up that might mimic how you would like to work with Python, things like that. So I will set just a short timer. So maybe just set a timer for 3 minutes and just give you guys an opportunity to play around with that. I will stop sharing my screen, and then I will take a look at what questions are in the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, they're more than welcome to do that as well.
Yes, hi, good morning, David.
Good morning, Abdulrahman.
Hi, thank you for the workshop. Yeah, I have like one concern. So now you mentioned that I can run my, let's say, my program or something through the script, and I can do that on the notepad or through the Jupyter itself. So what are the differences or the similarities, or which would be like considered as a best practice?
So good question. So I'm going to go back and just share my screen again.
Yeah, it's also in the chat, by the way. So if you.
Okay. Okay. So it's a good question. So to some degree, I guess I should have demoed over here. If you type, let me just add. So if you type your Python code in a notebook cell, so we haven't gotten to this yet, but it's a good time to talk about it. Then just like in the console where I showed you, you can do multiple lines of Python code inside of a notebook cell. And then hit Shift and Enter to evaluate that cell and get the results back within the notebook. So to some degree, you can use a notebook, or you can do this kind of writing in a script and then executing the script from within the Ipython console or from a terminal. And the differences between the two, so notebooks are incredibly popular as a way for kind of developing and prototyping your work, because you can get up and running quickly. They're kind of self-documenting, because as we'll see in a minute, you can intersperse like text and explanations of what the code is doing with the actual text that's running itself. But if you are developing programs that you want to use for your research, and you want the work to be as easily reproducible as possible, or you want to be able to run it on larger computing clusters, then you should write your write Python scripts. That was the timer for the exercise. You can also convert Jupyter notebooks to Python scripts. And effectively, they just comment out everything that's not a code cell. And then you can take a Jupyter notebook and then run it as if it was a Python script, and you'll get the same results. So to some degree, it's kind of a matter of personal preference and choice. But personally, I tend to use notebooks when I'm developing new projects, when I'm prototyping, if I'm developing something that I want to present to somebody later. So a lot of the work that I did with the Saudi Electric Company, for example, I did in notebooks. And then I then use those notebooks to present my work to the executives from the Saudi Electric Company. But for the notebooks that I write for my more research-focused work here at KAUST, I tend to either run those notebooks as Python scripts or extract the important computationally intensive parts of the notebook and put it in a Python script, which I then run on, say, Ibex or some public cloud computing resources, or Shaheen, something like that. Does that answer your question?
Perfectly, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So we've played around with JupyterLab a little bit. So the next thing I want to do is talk a little bit more about the notebook. So the notebook, so now I'm going to get rid of Python scripts and console. And for the rest of the day, we're going to be primarily working in the notebook, or almost exclusively working in the notebook. So one of the things that's neat about the Jupyter Notebook is that you can intersperse text cells, like this text cell that I created here, and code cells. And that allows you to kind of create this living computational document. So with code cells, when you evaluate a code cell, or sorry, with a text cell, when you type in the text that you want using a markup language called Markdown, which allows you to do, kind of simple wiki kind of markup language. And when you hit Shift and Enter to execute a text cell, it renders it in the browser with some formatting. When you're in a code cell and you type some Python code and you hit Shift and Enter, it executes the Python code in that cell and then returns the result to your browser. And there are two modes within JupyterLab. There's command mode and edit mode. So if you select, if I click, so I clicked here in this code cell. When you're in edit mode, the cell will be highlighted, so in blue. So you see how there's like a blue box around this cell? So in edit mode, when you're in edit mode, you're editing the cell, so you're typing text. So I could type some text in here. So, and then, so I'm editing. So that's what edit mode does. So when you're in the other mode, I said is command mode. So to command mode, if you're in edit mode, you can hit escape and you'll be in command mode. So in command mode, you can do things like move cells around. So you can like drag and drop cells and move them around. You can also use keyboard shortcuts. So there's some keyboard shortcuts like in command mode, if you hit the letter A, it will create a new cell above the current cell. Then, so if I go back and highlight this cell again, so by clicking on it, it takes me into edit mode. And if I hit escape, it takes me to command mode. There's another keyboard shortcut B, which will create a cell below the current cell. There's another command X. So if I'm in command mode, you can always make sure that you're in command mode by just hitting escape. And then if you hit X, so notice that deleted a cell. You can also hit Z to undo the last cell operation. So if you deleted a cell accidentally, you can just hit escape and then hit Z, and it will undo the cell deletion that you previously did. So, and anytime you want to go into edit mode, so here we have a cell that's highlighted. If I hit enter, then it's going to take me into the cell and put me in edit mode. You can see that it has a blue box around it, so it's in edit mode, this kind of stuff. Okay. If you want to, so this cell here that I have created, by default, all cells are code cells. So you can see up here at the top, it says code. You can actually click this drop-down menu to manually select if you wanted to make it into a markdown cell for typing markdown or not. You can do that with a keyboard shortcut. If you hit escape to go from edit mode to command mode and then hit M, notice this little box with a colon dropped away. So that now you're in you've converted a code cell to a markdown cell. You can see also up here at the top, this now says markdown instead of code. So then in here, I could type things like, so I could use markdown syntax. So 2 hashes is a subheader. So this is a subheader for my markdown cell. And then if you hit shift and enter, that renders the markdown in the browser. So you've now created a subheader. So you can double click on the cell to go into edit mode. And then you could do things like you can create a bulleted list. Things like this. You can create a numbered list. You can embed hyperlinks in text. So if I wanted to embed a hyperlink in a text, so you surround the text that you want to embed the link into with square brackets, and then inside of parentheses, you put the link that you want to embed. I've got BinderHub here, so I will just embed the link to binder. And then when you evaluate the cell with Shift and Enter, then it renders. So you've got bulleted lists, numbered lists, and then a clickable hyperlink. So I can click that, and it will open Binder in another tab. Markdown is quite flexible and powerful. It does most of the things that HTML does. And then actually if you can't do what you want to do within Markdown and you know HTML, you can actually write HTML, raw HTML into a Markdown cell, and it will display properly. So actually, let's give it. I think I can do a quick, interesting example of that. So if we hit Escape and then A to create a cell above the bottom cell, I can hit M now to create a Markdown cell, and I think even paste embed videos. So I will go to Calst VizLab YouTube channel and find here's the video of me talking about SQL, and then share, and then embed, copy. Let's see if this works. Well, that worked when I tried it earlier. Okay, I will figure out why that's not working on our next break and come back and explain why it doesn't seem to be working as expected. Yeah, okay, well, we'll come back to that. I'll put a little note to myself to do this video work properly. Okay. So in the lecture notes, there is quite a bit more about creating and doing Markdown text and things like that, and links and whatnot. So let's take the next 5 minutes and just experiment with creating these different kinds of cells in Jupyter, in the Jupyter notebook. So code cells and Markdown cells. Experiment a little bit with Markdown Markdown syntax. If there are no questions, I'll poke around and see if I can fix that video embed. You can also do equations. So there's the last exercise shows you how to use LaTeX or LaTeX to render mathematical equations. So we'll talk about that. So I'll set a timer for 4 minutes maybe, and you guys can have a work through those exercises. I'll stop sharing momentarily, and then I'll see what kind of questions we have in the chat. And obviously you can unmute yourself and ask questions as well. So there's a question in the chat, so what is the main difference between Ipython and Python in command line? So Ipython is in short for interactive Python. So if you were to, the easiest way is to just demonstrate this. So if you were to, I'll just open a terminal. So in a terminal, if you were to type Python, well, actually here in this terminal, I need to, first I need to actually activate the conda environment. Oh, no, I don't. Yeah, okay. Here, if I was to just type Python, then I get a standard Python interpreter. So inside this Python interpreter, it's really, really bare bones.
Sorry, but we don't see the screen you are sharing.
Ah, thank you. Thank you. I forgot I had stopped sharing the screen. Okay, so I opened up, let's just do this again. So if you open up a terminal, so the question was about what's the difference between Python and Ipython. So if you open a terminal and you were to type Python, so this is the bare bones Python interpreter. And inside this Python interpreter, you can type Python code. So I can type, print hello world, and it prints hello world. I could do, simple arithmetic, this kind of stuff. But if I was to do, if I was to try to do something more sophisticated, like we haven't gotten to for loops yet, but if I was to try to do a for loop or something that required typing multiple lines of Python text, then it quickly becomes really annoying. So I have to do, I have to manually type everything. So what do I want to do here? So if I wanted to square this and print, but then if I made a mistake, like here, I forgot to close the parenthesis on my print function, I can't actually go back and do this. So the only way to, I'd have to hit enter, and then this worked because Python ignored the white space, but I can't go back and edit it. It's a bit messy. Like it's not, it's the bare bones Python interpreter is really, it's too bare bones for actual use. So the Ipython console, so here I'll just quit. The Ipython console is what you get when you launch the console. And here you can do multi-line text editing. So I could do and it does things like it auto completes closing parentheses, so I don't have to worry about making those kinds of mistakes. But if I did make a mistake, I can go back and edit the multiple lines of code if I want. And then when I execute the code, it runs. So typically, if you're using a Python console, it's almost always an Ipython console. No one really uses a plain Python console. Does that answer your question, Huang? Let's check the chat. So the question, there's a question in the chat, does Ipython have somewhat a new syntax? So the answer is generally no. So there are some things called magic commands, and we'll talk a little bit about Actually, no, we're not going to cover magic commands today. So there are some magic commands that let you do some additional things within Ipython that you wouldn't be able to normally do within within a plain Python interpreter. But other than that, no, it's exactly the same. It's the same language. Good question. Okay, so I'm just going to close these. And I didn't have time to go and check on the video embed, so that will have to wait. Okay, so good question. So now we're going to just want to demo one more thing before we move on to the next episode, and that's maths equations. So I'll just copy this example here. So I will do escape and A and M. So, and then I'll put, you can also embed maths equations. So if you know LaTeX, so LaTeX or LaTeX is a markup language that's used quite a lot for typesetting academic papers, particularly technical papers that have a lot of maths equations and things like that. You can use LaTeX inside a Jupyter notebook to render your maths equations. You can put it inside a $sign on both the left and the right, and then when you evaluate this, it will typeset this mathematical equation. You can put it inside of $2 and that will center align your mathematical equation. So I'll do 1 for left align. And I'm just going to copy this and I'll put $2 for center align. So if I put 2, then this will be a center align. Yep. Okay. So closing the Jupyter Lab server, we're not going to do that here, but if you go to File and then you can shut down your Jupyter Lab server, and that would shut it down. We don't want to do that right now. Okay. All right, so we covered basically the difference between plain Python scripts and Jupyter notebooks. We showed examples of editing a Python script, editing a Jupyter notebook, running an example of running a Python script. Then we moved more into the notebooks and talked about command versus edit mode. We used the keyboard and mouse to select and edit cells and showed how the notebook will turn Markdown into kind of pretty printed documentation. And if you're confused about Markdown, it kind of does most of what HTML does. It just does it in a much more straightforward manner, or less easier to get started manner, I should say. Okay. So we've been going for about an hour now. So I just want to take a short 5-minute break, get some water, go to the restroom if you need to, and then we will come back and pick up in the next with the next lesson. Okay, so I'm just going to pause the recording now, and I'll be back in a couple minutes. Okay. Okay, so we're back from our break. We finished the running and quitting, so the basic introduction to Jupyter Lab and Python, Ipython consoles and Python scripts and things like that. So the next thing that I want to do is move on to the next episode, which is on variables and assignment. And so I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit. That first episode, because we're doing a lot of just starting and trying new things and experimenting, it takes a little longer, but now I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about how to store data in programs, and we're going to talk about simple scalar values and how to perform calculations, and then how to trace how value changes in programs that use scalar assignment. Okay. And at this point, okay. So going along in the notebook, variables and assignment. Okay, so when I say a variable, what that is it's a name for a value. And in Python, like in many programming languages, the equals sign or the equals operator is the operator that assigns a value, which is typically listed on the right-hand side, to a variable, which would be the name for that value that's listed on the left-hand side. So age equals 42 is assigning the value, the scalar value 42 to the variable age. And if we want to put another one in here, we can assign to the variable first name the value Ahmed. And now when we hit Shift and Enter, we actually execute that code and perform the assignment of those values to those variables. Now, just some conventions in variable names. So variable names can only contain letters, digits, and underscores. So here's an example of where I used an underscore to separate two words in a variable name. You can't start with a digit. So this would be a valid variable name. So, well, actually, I could put a number anywhere, but I just put it at the end. But trying to start a variable with a number will give a syntax error. So basically, you can't start with a variable with a number. Start a variable name with a number. Okay, so if you want to display values, so you notice that when we executed this cell, these values weren't actually displayed. So typically in a Python script or in a notebook that you want to make sure things will be printed out if you convert it to a script, you should use the print function to display values. So now, if we were to print age, we would get 42. And so this print statement will work whether you're in a notebook or you're in a script. In notebooks, we can actually just reference but not in scripts. So if you just put the name of the variable and you execute the cell, you get the output. But in a script, this wouldn't print, or this wouldn't be captured in the output of running the script. So just be in mind. So whenever I'm writing a notebook, if I think that I might convert the notebook to a Python script later, and I want to make sure that the thing that is being displayed will be displayed when the print or when the script is run, then I will always put print. Or you could just, when in doubt, always put print, and that will be sure, guaranteed to do what you want, whether your notebook is running in a notebook or whether your notebook has been converted to a script. So variables have to be assigned a value before they can be used. So must be created before used. So if I was to try to print last name, I would get a name error because there's nothing that's been assigned to last name. So I could go down here in the next cell and actually do last name and assign the value, the string Jones, to last name. And now if I go up here, this now works. But now this is also an example of an anti-pattern in notebooks called out of order cell execution. So if I was to re-execute this restart this notebook and re-execute the cells from top to bottom, I would get an error when I got down to this point because the last name has not been defined before it's referenced. So actually it would be a better approach would be to define, this variable in here. Actually, I'll do this in another cell, so you'll have this mistake if you want to come back to it. Yeah. So basically, make sure that your variables are defined before you use them. So obviously variables persist between cells in a notebook. So we've seen examples of that. So that's what makes, I've defined, age and first name up here, but then I used age here. And, I can, print first name down here. Oops. So variables exist between cells. Variables can be used in calculations. So we can take the variable age and we can reassign it to be the age plus 3. And then we can run a print statement. So now and there's extra white space in here. So, and actually, if you keep running this, you'll see that age keeps being incremented every time. So this just goes up by 3 every time you run it. So indexing. So we've seen strings. So if we have, you can index a string. So if we have the string helium, then if we wanted to get the first letter in the string, we can use square brackets for indexing. We'll see lots of examples of square bracket indexing today. And if we use 0, then that will pick out the H from the atom name. So this is both an example of indexing, but also Python indexing starts with 0. So it's 0-based indexing. So that's important to note. So that's different than some languages that have 1-based indexing. Okay. So that's an example of picking out a particular element in a string. So you can also do substring slicing. So let's have another atom name of sodium. And then if we want to pick out the first 2 characters in the name, we use square brackets again, and then we include the start character and then a colon and then the stop character. But the stop character is not, the upper end of the slicing interval is exclusive or not included. So if we want to get the first 2, elements, then we need to put a 2 here. And that will select out the 0th and the first element, but not the second. And so you have your start up to, but not including stop, as the way to do the slicing in Python. Any data type that has a notion of length, you can get the notion of the length of that by using the built-in function len for length. So if we ask for the length of atom name, then that will give 6. So that's the number of characters in the string. And again, I can wrap this in a print function to guarantee that will be displayed if I was running this as a script. So Python is case sensitive. So if you were to have name as so these are 2 different variables. So that's something to be aware of. So generally variables are all lowercase and written in something like it's called snake case, which is basically variables are written in snake case. How about this? Something like this. So snake case is basically all lowercase, and then you generally separate words by underscores. So the underscore stands in for the white space, basically. And then things like classes and modules, which we're not going to talk about, are typically written in starting with uppercase, or what's called camel case. So classes are written in camel case. Okay. So use meaningful variable names. So I'll just mark this as naming conventions. So use meaningful variable names. So if you have some experience in MATLAB, so in MATLAB, convention is to kind of write your equations as if you're writing mathematics. So you have a lot of MATLAB scripts where you'll have variable names like X or I or M or N, J, K, things like this. The things that would show up in mathematical notation. Python, the convention is really focused on readability of code. So try to use meaningful variable names. See some examples of that. So now there's some exercises for you to do. So I'd like you to take 5 minutes and go through the exercises here at the end. So there's one on swapping values. So basically, this isn't a coding exercise. It's kind of like walking through and making sure you understand how the assignment traces through. And then there's some others here for kind of predicting what the values of variables are going to be, choosing good variable names, slicing practice, things like that. So why don't you take 4 or 5 minutes, and I'll set a little timer to keep us on track, and then I'll take questions just like we've been doing, either in chat or you can unmute yourself and ask questions, whichever you prefer.
Variable versus classes.
I'm sorry, so you have to repeat the question.
Yeah, variable versus classes. What are like?
Variable. So okay. Gosh. So at the end of today, I'll provide you some references for classes and modules. I don't want to that's a bit out of scope for today's material, and I feel like it will muddy the waters a bit too much. So I'll provide you some references on where you can go to learn about classes. I'll stick one in the chat now in case I forget. There's a great book called Think Python by Alan Downey. And it's gone through several editions. So I'm going to put this in the chat now. There are several books on deep dive into Python and things like that, and I'll mention some more later. But this is kind of a good place to get started. And Alan Downey is a great writer, and he's written many books on how to use Python to explore different computational topics, from your Bayesian statistics to frequency statistics and complexity theory and all kinds of stuff. So he's a good person to know. So Glendon, there's a question in chat that you might be able to shed some light on. So it's a question about Python programs when running on Slurm. So the results of the intermediate print only show up in the output file when the program finally exits. I think that's to do with some kind of buffering that's done on Slurm that is not something from within Python. But I think that's coming from Slurm, but I'm not 100% certain about that.
So, okay, so thanks for pointing that out. So you're right, it has to do with the buffering for Slurm. So IBEX is a batch system. Why would you want your results immediately? So it sounds like that you're trying to use it interactively. As long as the output gets into your log files, you'll see the results. But if you're trying to use it interactively, like on the debug nodes, you can use -u, which is for unbuffered, as part of the Slurm like srun commands that would let you get the output interactively. And you can use it also if you run like srun, the typical like time and allocation and a partition equals debugs, for example. And then you can have like, I would use like --pty and then -u for unbuffered, and then I could have like a bash -i for interactive. So yeah, it sounds like this is a functionality of Slurm. And basically, if you're running in batch mode, which typically if you're running your Python code, you wouldn't want to be monitoring it all the time. So for efficiency reasons, Slurm just kind of has a very large buffer that it stores things into until it has to write things out, which is like when the program finishes, or when the buffer gets filled out.
I think there might also be a way to do this with Python. So there is a dash. So Glendon, you mentioned a -u option for Slurm.
Yes.
So there's also a similar option for the Python. So if you launch, like within a training job on IBEX, you'll typically have a Python call and then followed by some script basically that you're launching with Python. Python also has a -u, -u command line option, which will run it in an unbuffered mode, basically. And that might also do similar to what you want, but I'm not entirely certain about that.
So I would discourage.
I'm putting a link to
Sure.
command line docs for Python for anybody who's interested in learning more.
So I would discourage the use of unbuffered. It's there for a reason, because the performance benefit is huge. So typically, if Slurm is buffered, running Python unbuffered is unlikely to help. So what it would mean is that, because in that case, you basically have two buffers. You have the buffer from you have the slurm buffers for the standard out standard error, but you also have the Python buffers for those as well. And so instead of going to display every time there's a character output, it might just go to display when there's, you know, it reaches the end of the line. But if slurm is buffered, you know, you won't get the output any faster. You definitely need to have slurm unbuffered to be able to see at least a line at a time, and then Python standard buffering, which is probably like line based, is good enough.
That's a good question though, because this comes up a lot with users who are doing machine learning and data science on Ibex, who are used to debugging their programs on their local machines, their laptops, or their workstations. And so they get something that works, and then they'll take it to Ibex and run it. And then the first thing that they'll do, because they'll have print statements or they'll have logging enabled for their jobs, and they're used to seeing it basically just streaming out into their standard out on their laptop or workstation, and they'll go launch a job, come back an hour later, check their slurm.out file, and there won't be anything there. And then they'll wonder, like, well, what is going on? Like, where's my logging? Where's my, like, is my job actually working? And that's this kind of buffering, the buffering settings are important to kind of understanding how to debug that problem.
So
it's a problem. It's just kind of how to understand the difference between what you expected the behavior to be and what the actual behavior is.
So if users have an issue, you know, if they can raise a ticket, ibex@hpc.caus.edu.sa, and we can help them kind of work through. We can help them work through that particular example. So as long as your output arrives eventually in the log files, you're probably good. You know, you just wait till the job finishes. If you want to work interactively stuff, there is the debug partition, but that starts to get into kind of like inter to Ibex territory. But
yeah, so this is a great. So I've made a note of this question to follow up on later, because you're not the first person who've asked this. So like having a nice explanation of aligning user expectations with what the default system behavior would be, and then also explaining when you might want to change the default system behavior on the buffering end of things, and what the trade-offs are. It sounds like a good little like training bit for one of us to write up and then put somewhere for reference. So thank you for asking that question.
Cool, yeah, thanks.
Let me just make a note of it. Okay, cool. So let us, I guess before we move on, are there any questions about the exercises? I see a question about negative indexing, so let's talk about that. So I need to share my screen, share screen. Okay. So the slicing concepts is, so let's go through these, let's just go through these slicing concepts. So I will put this in here, so make it a little extra size. All right, so let's start with a variable that we can slice. So some very long word. I can't even spell it. well, okay, we don't need that. Let's take this. It's big enough. Okay. Wow, just looking at the spelling of this, it's hard for me to believe that this is an actual English word, but okay, it'll serve our purposes. Okay, so we have a string and we want to demonstrate some slicing concepts. So the basic slicing that we learned was to provide a start index. So maybe we start at the 0, 1, 2, and we go up to, but not including the stop index. And so this would give us O through the 9th. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it ends with a C. So that's this substring here. Yep. So including start up to stop, and then I'll use the kind of the mathematical notation of a closed bracket is inclusive and parentheses is exclusive. And then this is a comment. So any line that starts with a hash is a comment and is just ignored. Okay, so there's our very long word. Then the next one that we wanted to look at was what happens if we don't include the start. So if we leave out the start, the assumption is that 0 is the value that is included there. So it inserts a 0. Then what were some of the other ones? So if you leave out if you include the start but not the stop, then it runs basically through the end. And here we're using these examples as strings, but the same kind of slicing semantics will be true for any other data type that you can slice, like lists or arrays and things like that. Then just a colon. So if you leave out the start, it goes from the beginning up to, but not including the stop. If you leave out the stop, it goes from the start all the way to the end. So then you might think that, well, if I just leave out both of them, I'm probably going to get the whole string. And that's exactly what you would get. So here's an example of negative indexing. So negative indexing, this would select the last element in the thing that you're indexing. So that pulls out the end. So that's this last character here. And you can keep going backwards. So if you did -2, that would give you to this O. So that now an example would be, another example would be if you put a colon in here, so then this will go from an assumed start of 0 up to, but not including minus the -2 character, where you -1, -2. So this goes up to, but then not including the O. So that actually should be all of that. Can't quite make it on the same line, but you can see how that is the expected outcome. Okay, so see what we have in the chat. How to slice a string to fetch characters at odd or even indexes. Okay. So I'm not sure this is mentioned in the lecture notes, but I think that there is a start, stop, and step index. So let's try this. If we wanted to start at 1 and go to the end, and then go every 2. Okay, so the full slicing notation is start, stop, step. So then this example here starts at the first character. The stop index is left out. So that means it goes all the way to the end, but then it goes every other character. So instead of including every character, it goes every other character. So it goes 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. So this would be selecting odd indices. And then if you wanted even, then you would do this, I think. So starting at 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on and so forth. So if we go back up here, here is 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. So 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Yeah, so that looks right. So Daria is asking a question. No, so this afternoon session is going to be covering more advanced topics, pandas, and things like that. So this morning we're kind of just getting the basics down. Okay, so I think I've covered about everything I want to cover on variables. So let's go ahead and move on to the next episode. So data types and data conversion. So this one, so we're a little bit kind of behind time where I want to be. We've had some good questions and some good discussion, but we've fallen a bit behind. So I'm just going to very quickly talk through this, and then we're going to hop to the next lesson, because this episode basically introduces some basic data types, ints, floats, and strings, and then shows some built-in functions to convert from one type to the other type. But it's fairly self-explanatory. I think you can probably come back and go over this on your own if you are so inclined. But basically, every value has a type. We've so far seen kind of ints and strings, but there are also floats like 3.14159 or minus 2.5. There's a built-in function called type that allows you to get the type of a value. So you can get the type of a value. Types are important in that they control kind of what kind of operations you can perform with a particular value. So with simple types like ints and floats and strings, types are what control what numerical operations can you do with integers and floats, and for strings, some numerical operations are well defined for strings and some are not. So types kind of control again, what you can do with a particular value of that type. And here we're doing simple values like scalars, floats, and strings, but a pandas data frame is an example, is a more elaborate example of a type. A dictionary or a list are more other examples of a type. A NumPy array, a scikit-learn model, a TensorFlow tensor, or PyTorch tensor. These are all examples of types that have well-defined operations, things like that. There's some other examples of built-in functions. And then there are functions like int and stir and float that convert things back and forth between integers and floats and stuff like that. In Python, so the division, one thing I will mention is, so there's an exercise here on division. So in Python 3, the division operator performs floating point division, which is kind of like what you would expect if you were going to do division. But if you want integer division, then there is a double slash operator that performs integer division and a modulo operator, the percent. Those are sometimes useful for indexing operations. Okay, but that, a lot of the basic, the details of basic data types, I think, I'll just skim over those and move on to the next episode. Okay. All right, built-in functions and help. So I definitely want to cover. This. So. Okay. So what we're going to talk about now is how to use built-in functions and how to get help, and talk a little bit about errors that can show up in programs. And so hopefully after this episode, you should be able to kind of explain the purpose of a function, call some built-in Python functions, talk about nested function calls, and then be able to get help. So be able to find documentation for built-in functions, correctly describe situations, and with syntax errors and name errors, basically syntax errors and runtime errors, the difference between the two. Okay, so functions. So we've seen a couple built-in functions like the print function. So functions can take 0 or more arguments. So if you call the print function with 0 arguments, it's just going to print a blank line. We've seen it called with 1 argument before, so something like this. Print can be called with multiple arguments, so sometimes functions will have multiple arguments, and print will concatenate words together. And put a space in between. So, but this is not so much an example of how to use the print function. It's more just that functions can have 0 or 1 argument or multiple arguments. Other examples would be max, min, and round. So you can have max, and you can put in multiple numerical arguments. You can also do min. There's round. So max and min work for not just numbers, but basically any kind of data type that can be ordered. So obviously numbers can be ordered, strings can be ordered because they'll be ordered kind of alphabetically, but also more elaborate data types could also have an ordering defined over them. And if they do, then you can use max and min functions to find the max and min element for those data types. So some functions might only work for a certain certain types of arguments. So for example, you can compare. So if I wanted to compare so you can take the max or min of strings and the max or min of numbers, but if you try to do the following, so this raises a type error, and the reason is that whilst you can compare, numbers and you can compare strings, you can't compare a number with a string because these are different types, and that's the type error that you're seeing here. So basically, some functions require types to have all of the have arguments whose types are all the same, or they have more complicated function signatures where you have to have types in a particular sequence of in a particular order. Okay, so another example would be round. So round will take a number and by default round it to the nearest integer. You can actually control that behavior by adding a second argument, which controls the precision of the rounding. But this raises the question of like, okay, well, how would you know to do that? You know, how do you know basically how these functions behave unless you you know, use them a bunch or something like that. So there's a okay. And the answer comes down to help. So one way to get help is to use the help function. So if you pass in the name of a function to the help function itself, it returns something called the doc string, the documentation string, for the function, which is just this information here. And so the function signature is usually returned in the first line of the doc string. So the round function signature, you put in a number, and then there's an argument called in digits, which controls the precision of the rounding. So we could pass the number of digits by just putting in the number of digits, or we could actually pass in the name of the argument. This is called the keyword, passing it in as a keyword argument, and it will give us the same answer. And notice if we mistyped, or if we call it in digit instead of in digits, we would get this kind of a type error. So it would basically say that this in digit is an invalid keyword argument for the function round. So if you make a typo with your keyword argument, then you might get something like this. The nice thing about, oh yeah, so that's all I will say about that. So we saw one way to get help. There are several other ways to get help. So you can put a question mark at the end of the function that you are interested in learning more about, and then hit Shift and Enter to evaluate the cell again, and it gives you the same information. So you can see if you compare, it just displayed slightly differently. I actually find the question mark, the way that they've laid it out, where they've, the signature and the doc string and the type, much more user-friendly with the question mark. This is the one that I most often use. You can also put your cursor inside the parenthesis and hit Shift and Tab. And this brings up the same information, but within like a little pop-up box. Now, the thing that I don't like about this method of getting help on a function is that as soon as you start typing, it goes away. And so that's not such a big deal for a simple function signature like this, because you can look at it and you probably remember, okay, there's two arguments. I need to put the number first and then the number of digits second. But if this had like 20 different arguments and they all did something important, it would be hard to remember, and you'd have to keep checking it again and again. So what I often do is I will use the question mark to extract the doc string, and then I will come down here and I would fill in, my the function signature based on the doc string. And then once I got something that was working, then I would just go up here, escape X, and remove kind of that doc string or something. I'll do escape A and put it back for this notebook. But that way I have the doc string, I can refer to it as much as I need. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between syntax errors and runtime errors. So a syntax error is something that comes up when so syntax versus runtime errors. So a syntax error occurs when the Python interpreter cannot convert what you have typed into valid Python code. So for example, if you do something like forget to close a quote, this will give you a syntax error because the Python interpreter, which reads this code and then tries to convert it into Python bytecode, which is then executed by to get the result, it doesn't know how to make that conversion. You've given invalid Python, so that's a syntax error. So syntax errors are typically pretty easy to debug. You might make a lot of syntax errors as you're getting started programming in Python because you don't know the syntax. But once you learn the syntax errors are usually easy to fix. Python is pretty good about both giving reasonable errors for syntax errors, error messages for syntax errors, and then also pointing, so you can see how it's pointing to this missing quote here. Another example would be something like extra equals in an assignment operator. So that's also would be a syntax error. Another classic is forgetting to close your parentheses, but that's used to be very common, but now most modern IDEs will actually autocomplete string quotes and parentheses for you, so you don't make these errors. But if you left off a closing parenthesis, you would get some kind of an error like that. Okay. Runtime errors are more, so I'll put up here. So these are all examples of syntax errors. And then these will be so an example of a runtime error. So if I define age to be, 121, and then maybe 21, and then I use that value later in a calculation, but I maybe mistype it, just make a typo. So this is actually a runtime error and not a syntax error. And the reason is that the Python interpreter interprets these two lines, and it says, right, this is valid Python code. There's nothing wrong with this Python code. I'll happily interpret this into bytecode and then send it off to be executed on the hardware. But then what happens is that in when the Python code runs, it hits this variable, and it's like, well, there is no variable AEG. You've not defined a variable AEG, so I don't know what to do with this. So it's a name error. This variable is not defined, and it will stop. And obviously you will look at that and you think, okay, so this is just a simple typo. I can fix that. And you can fix it pretty quickly and move on. That's fine. But, if instead of this first line, you had a bit of Python code that takes like, several hours to run, then this runtime error would be really annoying, right? Because it would have, code might have run correctly for several hours, and then it hits this typo here and stops, and you get an error and you've got to start over again. So runtime errors can be very expensive, typically much more expensive than syntax errors, because syntax errors you often catch much more quickly in the debugging process than runtime errors. Okay, so there are a few exercises with built-in functions that I'd like you to take a look at. So let's just take 3 minutes and have a look at these examples on built-in functions. And if you have any questions about them, we can talk about them or do them together. And then I'm happy to take questions either in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask questions. So I've set a timer for about 3 minutes. So there's a question in chat, is complex number operations supported? Yes. And I think that is actually discussed in data types and conversion. Division, strings to numbers, arithmetic. Yeah. So there is an exercise on complex numbers and how they're supported in Python in the standard library. But if you were doing kind of scientific computing with complex numbers, then those are also supported in NumPy and SciPy and the libraries that you would use. We'll talk about those later today for doing actual kind of scientific computing calculations with complex numbers. But the short answer is yes, they are supported. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'll just let you guys kind of work along on those exercises. And I'll kind of scan ahead here and see what we can do to get back on time. Actually, just looking ahead a little bit, this might be a good point to take just another like 5-minute break, because then we can push through till lunchtime. So basically for the next 45 minutes and try to get through libraries and get into pandas a little bit before lunch. Okay, so we'll take a 5-minute break here. So you can go get some water, cup of tea, something like that. And then we will resume at about 11:15, so a little bit more than 5 minutes. And then we'll push through the rest until lunch with covering libraries and start in on pandas. Okay? All right, cool. So I'll see you guys at 11:15. Okay. So we're back again from our break, and I've started the recording up again. Okay, so any questions about those exercises on the built-in functions or help before I move on to the next episode on libraries? Nope? Okay. Moving along then.
Can I ask, exercises are in each of the notes that you provided at the end in yellow, like kind of?
Yes. So the exercises are typically, sometimes they're interspaced in the lecture notes, but most of the time they're more towards the end, and they all have the solutions if you're.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So let's move on to. I'll start sharing my screen again. So we're going to move on to the next. The next episode. So libraries. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how to use software that other people have written and how to find out what that software does. We'll talk a little bit. I'll show you how to import and use Python modules and packages from the standard library, and then how to import libraries and packages from other that are not in the standard library. Talk about the difference between those two. Okay, so Python has a huge community of users who make their own, who make Python libraries and packages and contribute them to the ecosystem. In addition, it has a very large standard library. So the standard library is a collection of modules and packages that are available and come whenever you install Python itself. And so there's a link here to the Python standard library. So if you were to open that in another tab, you can glance through here and see all of the documentation. So all of these are libraries that are available in the Python standard library. So whenever you install Python, you get all of these built-in libraries. So there's some stuff for numerical and mathematical modules, random number generation, some basic statistics, modules for functional programming, a whole bunch of stuff. Now, if you have created what's called a third-party library or package, so these are created and are kind of build in additional functionality besides what you have in the standard library, and these are typically put on the Python package index. And so this is basically the location where all of the third-party libraries for Python, whether they're made by an individual single developer, or whether they're made by companies like Google or Microsoft or Amazon or Facebook, they all exist here on the Python package index, and you can download them and use them. So once you've downloaded a package, if you want to use it, then you have to import it. And so even libraries that are part of the Python standard library have to be imported before they can be used. So now I'm going to switch over to Jupyter Lab and go back to okay. So for example, if we wanted to use the math library, which is part of the Python standard library, then we need to import it first. So we import the math library. And now that we have imported the math library, we can access functionality from within that library to do things. So for example, the math library has some numerical constants defined, like pi. And we access functionality within the math library by typing the name of the library followed by a dot, and then it will either be a function or a constant or something that we're accessing. And then we can access the mathematical constant for pi, or we could do something like use that in a numerical calculation. So the cosine of pi is math.cosine of math.pi. something like this. Yeah. Okay. Notice that if I try to do like math.cosine of pi, so this doesn't work. So this expects that there will be some, this is a runtime error. So Python looked for a variable called pi that was defined somewhere in the in scope and didn't find it. And so it threw a name error. So even though there is this math.pi, we actually have to put math.pi to get that to work. If you think this is a bit tedious to write math.this and math.that, it is tedious, and we will see, but we'll see how to get around that in just a minute. So if you want to find out what is available in the math module, you can use the help function on the module that you've imported, and then this will give you basically all of the functions or constants that are defined in the module, plus their function signatures and documentation, things like that. So there's quite a lot of documentation. There's also a link in here to the math module standard library documentation. So you could click and get a more, well, an HTML representation of the documentation, which is nicer to look at, perhaps. You also should be able to use, so here are all the constants that are defined. So they're not just pi, but there's e and tau, and then a representation for nan and infinity. Now, you should also be able to use something called tab completion. And for some reason, the tab completion is taking a while to load. Well, that really ought to load. Not quite sure why the tab completion is not working there. But you can also do the question mark. So if we did math.cosine with a question mark, we could get why is that not working? Lots of strange things are happening today. Not quite sure why that, probably not working for the same reason the tab completion doesn't seem to be working. Okay, well, let's come back to that. So how to import specific items from a library module. Okay, so if we don't want to import the whole modular package, we can import specific functionality with the following kind of syntax. So you can do from a particular module, import import some number of things. So in this case, we could do cosine, pi, we could also do sine and tangent. And then once we've imported these things, then we can use them without having to type math dot all the time. And then sine of pi divided by cosine of pi. So, so here we basically use these different functions that we've imported. Now, there's one kind of drawback of this is that if, for something like math, you're probably not going to define your own function. And we'll talk about defining our own functions later this afternoon, but you're probably not going to define a function called cosine or pi, or a constant called pi, or sine or tangent or something like this yourself. But if you had, and then you imported these individually from the library, they would overwrite anything that you had defined that had these names. So hopefully that makes sense. So if you defined a function called cosine, or COS, I guess we could just do it. So we'll see how to define a function later, but if I defined a function called cosine that took x and then returned x, so now if I did cosine of 3.14, it's just going to return that same value. And now if I import these functions again and run pi, or run cosine or COS function, now this function is not the function that I wrote up here. It's been overwritten by the function with the same name that I imported from math. So that can happen if you just import individual things. So rather than importing individual elements, if I want to avoid typing the module name over and over again, I will use what's called an alias. So I would import math as m. And from here, then I can do m.cosine, m.pi. And so now I always know that I'm using something from the m package, which I can look back in my import statements if I've forgotten that I've imported math as m. And so this, I think, strikes the right balance between productivity on your part, so not having to type the name of the library over and over again, but at the same time, eliminating the risk of accidentally clobbering something that you've defined that shares a name with something that you've imported from some other library. Some of this is a bit personal preference and how you want to do these things, but this use of aliases is very common. And you'll see that the canonical imports for like NumPy and SciPy and Pandas all use this alias imports syntax. So in the chat, people are saying that the tab function and question mark works for them. Well, I'm glad that it's working for you guys. I don't know why it's not working for me. I find it a bit troubling, but I'm glad that it's working for you. Are you using the? Now I'm curious. I have a hypothesis. So I'm just going to quickly open the public Jupyter lab and try something. Turning it off. Oh, it's working for you on the counts one. Okay, so there goes my hypothesis. My hypothesis is going to be something like there might be something set up on the counts Jupyter lab that's preventing the tab completion from downloading something that it needs. So if I try import math as m dot. Yeah, okay. So this is now working as I was expecting it to work. So when you do tab completion and on something that you've imported, then you get this nice, I mean, this is really slick. So you get this nice like listing, and you can see, you know, on the right-hand side kind of what the doc string is, and then you can see kind of what you're dealing with here. Okay. So but then this is working on the public BinderHub. So that was my hypothesis, but then you guys are saying that, so I'm just going to get rid of that. That some of you are using the Coust BinderHub, and you are able to get the able to get the tab completion to work properly? Huh. Okay, well, then I don't know. I'll flag this and mention it to my colleagues at IT Research Computing to try to figure out, is there anybody for whom it's not working besides myself? So, and by not working, I mean, after you have imported math as M and you put M dot and then hit tab, you should get, tab completion, not an actual tab. Okay. Awad, are you using the Kaust Jupyter Hub or the Kaust Jupyter Hub? Okay. Interesting. This will be a fun debugging exercise for. Yeah. Okay. So that works, but see, this doesn't work. And now that works. Yeah. But this didn't work. So now that works. Well, regardless, this will be an interesting debugging exercise, perhaps, for some of the for my IT research computing colleagues, because it's working for some Kaust folks, but not for others, and it's working for everybody on the public BinderHub. So, okay, cool. Well, noted for next time. Where were we? Libraries. So I talked about the alias. We talked about help, importing specific libraries. Right. Okay. So let's take a few minutes and take a look at these exercises. They involve, importing some things. This one in particular is really interesting. I would recommend that you take a look at this. See if you can figure out how to rearrange these code lines and fill in the blank to perform the computation that it's asking for. That's a fun exercise. So let's take 5 minutes and look at those exercises. I'll take questions if you have them, and then we'll move on to cover one more episode, I think, before we'll break for lunch. All right, and I will stop sharing my screen. So the exercises, if you're wondering where the exercises are at the bottom of the lesson. So each lesson, each episode in the lesson materials today has exercises, and they all look like this. So they have a little pencil or crayon, and then they have a question that you should be able to try to answer with writing some code, and then a solution to kind of provide a solution for that exercise. So while you guys are working on those exercises, does anybody have any questions they want to ask or they want to put in chat? No. Okay. Well, I'll just let you guys work quietly on those exercises then. Okay. Okay. So questions about those exercises? I do have one that I want to go over. I'm going to go over the jigsaw puzzle coding exercise together because that's a good one to practice on. But are there any other questions about the exercises? Okay. Right, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So I have, so basically I copied the code from the jigsaw puzzle programming example exercise. And so what we want to do is kind of rearrange this code and then fill in the blanks so that this code prints out a random base from this kind of sequence of DNA bases, A's, C's, G's, and T's. So randomly picks out a character from this sequence of bases and then prints out that character and then the index that that character corresponds to in the original string. So I'll kind of walk through this with you. So we need to import any libraries that we're going to use before we use them. So it's always a good idea. So I'll leave this as the start. And then this will be the result. So it's always a good idea to move any import statements to the start. And then I'll just comment these lines out so that I can execute the cell to show you that it works. Okay, so the next thing is that since the basis is our data, we probably are going to want to define that variable basis first, because remember, we have to define a variable before we can use it. Okay, so we'll define basis. Now, we need to select a random base from this basis, or from these bases. So a random character from this string. So we're given some hints here about how we might do this. So one of the ways that we could, one of the first things we need to do is maybe look at what is this random.randRange function. So we've imported the random package already. So if we do random.randRange with a question mark, then so we can see that it chooses a random item from start, stop. So, and then it says it fixes the problem with random, which includes the endpoint, which is probably not what we want. So this looks like it's going to select a random integer from start up to, but not including stop. So let's just test this. So I think that this should generate a random integer between 0 and up to, but not including 10. So 0 and 9. So if you keep executing this, it's just going to give you a random integer, and we should see, we should never see 10. I'm not seeing a 10 yet. If we could test our hypothesis even further. If we did this, then if it goes from 0 up to but not including 1, then this function should deterministically return 0 every time. And that does indeed do what I think it does. So that means then that if we wanted to pull out a random integer between 0, which corresponds to A, and what would we want to put on the upper bound so that we would always select an index which would point us to one of the characters in this string? Well, we remember our built-in len function from earlier. So the built-in function len will pull out the length of bases, which is 11. And so if we did something like this, then this would pull out a random integer between 0 up to, but not including the length of the basis string, which is what we want. And so the hint that they have given you is that now you can, if we call this in bases, and now if we were to do this, so this is now selecting out our random base. So if we assign this to a variable, we could maybe assign it to the variable random base, random index. Now we have everything that we need to complete the puzzle. So if we select out bases random index, then this is doing kind of what we want. Okay. Right. So that was just an example of how to kind of think through one of these little coding challenges, use the documentation, read through the documentation a little bit to kind of figure out what's going on, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes before I want to break for lunch, and the next episode is short, but it's also about loading data. And then once we have the data loaded, we're going to do interesting stuff with it. So I kind of feel like it's not really super helpful to load the data and then immediately break for lunch. So I propose that I'll just hang around for Q&A. And then when we come back from lunch at 1 o'clock promptly, we'll pick up with loading the data into a pandas data frame. And then the rest of the afternoon, all of the afternoon will be on how to use pandas for data analysis. Okay, so I will hang around. There looks like there might be a couple of questions in the chat. So that's right, Abdul Rahman, it's not inclusive, yeah. So the question was, will this rand range function ever choose the last index? So no, so you don't need the length. Okay, so this is a good question. So basically, so what happens if we, so bases, so the length of bases is 11. So if we try to do this, we're going to get an index out of range error, because there is no, even though the length of bases is 11, the indices into the bases string are 0, 1, 2, 3, up to 10. So that's the difference between the zero indexing. Good question. But the zero indexing is important because it differentiates Python from, well, all C-based languages use zero indexing. Other languages that are not C-based, like I think Fortran uses one-based indexing. MATLAB might also use one-based indexing. I'm not entirely sure. R uses one-based indexing, I know. So anyway, it's one of these things that you have to be aware of. You know, is your language zero-based indexing or one-based indexing? Python is zero-based indexing. Daria confirms that MATLAB is indeed one-based. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to hang around for questions for the next 10 minutes if anybody has them. Otherwise, we will pick up again after lunch. Remember that there is another meeting link. So I sent out 2 meeting invites. One was for the morning session. The second one was from the afternoon session. So the afternoon session will be a different meeting link, not the same meeting link. It just makes it easier for me to keep track of all the video recordings I'm doing. Okay, so hang around for the next 10 minutes if you have more questions that you want to ask. Glenn and I will be around, and then otherwise I'll see you promptly at 1 o'clock.
So when you were doing this random rand range, you were you put 0 and then 11 in the parentheses. You didn't have to put 0, right? It's like up.
So I think let's look at the documentation again.
I think you can just.
Okay, so if you look at the documentation, so the start is
there, yeah.
Is basically you have to provide. It expects you to provide a number, but I think if you just provide the start, it kind of translates that.
You start from 0
into this.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and so basically it has stop. So that's basically what it's doing.
Yeah.
Was that your question or?
Yeah, it was just because in the program itself
yes.
You didn't have that, and then you were using it. And
okay, yeah, that's a good.
I noticed that.
That's a good.
Okay.
That's a good catch.
Thank you. So how many libraries are kind of in use in industry, let's say, for the data analysis?
Oh, okay. So on my day in, day out work, so I probably use 6 to 10.
And which are
consistently.
like, do you use NumPy or SciPy for?
Yes. So okay. So the core ones that I use, and many of which we're going to talk about, would be. So this is like almost everything I write starts with like these three imports. The matplotlib for plotting, NumPy for array manipulation, and pandas for data analysis. And then the other libraries that I use, and again, I'll mention these this afternoon a little bit, are scikit-learn for doing machine learning, PyTorch or TensorFlow for doing deep learning. There are some a library called Dask, and another library called Rapids for doing GPU accelerated and scalable deep learning, things like that. So I'll mention these kind of this afternoon when we start doing some more advanced stuff, and then at the end of the day, because we're not going to cover, we'll cover some of like these three libraries this afternoon. But we're not going to talk about scikit-learn. I am going to be doing some training on scikit-learn in November that will be announced soon for doing like actual machine learning. And then these other more advanced libraries are just ones that I use and help people here at KAUST use, and we don't have any planned training for them yet, maybe in the future.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. But no, not really that many. I mean, like most people specialize in, you know, a relatively small handful of packages that they use on a day in, day out basis, even though there are, I don't know, there's like 200,000 packages or something on PyPI.
Okay.
Anyone else with questions?
So, hi, David. There's someone asking about in a for loop, using a for loop, I guess, for this.
Oh, so okay. So let's just leave we're going to talk about for loops this afternoon. So it's not immediately obvious to me. I mean, I see how you could write a for loop to do this, but not clear to me why you would. And let's just leave the discussion on for loops for this afternoon. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions in chat, and no one seems to be asking any more questions. So I'm happy to go ahead and leave it here. So the morning session is done, and I'll see everybody again at 1 o'clock in the afternoon session. And just remember that it's a different meeting link. And I'll keep an eye on my email. If for some reason people feel like they don't have the meeting link, I'll try to respond quickly with the meeting link. Okay, so thank you guys very much for spending the morning with me. I'll see you after lunch.
Cool. Take care. Thank you.
Yep.
See you later.